Brendan, welcome to the Health Path podcast. And between you and I think this is round 3, maybe round 4, if we include your podcast and my previous podcast.
Yeah, I think so. I'm starting to lose track. And I love that because you're literally one of my favorite people to talk to in this space because we always just feed off each other. So happy to be here with you, my friend.
Yeah, likewise. I've been excited about this. And thank you on air for your patience. I think I've asked us to reschedule this about 3 times. Parenting is just, it's beating my behind, shall we say.
No worries at all. It was funny to go through that. And like, you were so kind and apologetic. And I'm like, brother, like, you are a new father and I feel for you and with you. So like, you do your fatherhood thing and I'm happy to be here now.
Thank you. So obviously with the new podcast, we're going to have some sort of new listeners. So do you want to do a little bit of just an introduction and background to who you are and what you've been up to?
Sure. I'm starting to get better about like answering that succinctly because the past few years have been so evolutionary that I'm like, how do I even describe like what I do anymore? But I think I've really got it nailed down. So these days, like I am full-time, full on with research and education. Obviously, I still do, consulting with doctors, providers, coaches, self-healers. Just I consult with anybody that wants my input, but ultimately my full time is clinical research and developing educational materials around that. My main area of focus specifically is microglial activation, which is a very, very molecular, cellular specific thing. But when you kind of start zooming out as far as like why, I mean, I'm really passionate about educating people on how to self-heal or if they're doctors, how to heal their patients and clients from any sort of like neuroinflammatory process that's usually at the root of their metabolic and mental illnesses. So, the cellular details, unless you just really love science, that's kind of not what the focus is, but it's the higher level focus on what's dysfunctional about society these days and all the many kind of root cause factors playing into that and how it's just this metabolic and neuroinflammatory fire that we see even burning at the sociological level. And then there's the psychological that's underneath that, the physiological underneath that, and you keep peeling down and you get down to these microglial cells. But that's kind of like in the essence, just research and education, trying to teach people how to bust out of that, right? And I think we're going to get into some good stuff around that today.
Yeah, so I think, as a theme, sort of talking about metabolic mental health today is kind of what we'll dive into. And you've already mentioned these little guys, the microglia. Should we kind of just dive straight in? And for those people that aren't yet aware of what these are and what they do, let's go.
I think so. I've had a lot of reps with this, and I can, consolidate it where nobody disagrees that chronic inflammation drives chronic disease. Everybody accepts that because the body of evidence, the literature, that's gone mainstream. And maybe not everybody knows that. Otherwise, 88% of Americans wouldn't be metabolically ill. But, it's widely agreed upon in a lot of different levels. But it's weird how when you take that 1 degree further, and obviously there's this delay effect of like what's coming out in the literature versus what has a massive body of evidence in the literature versus what's dripping into clinical practice and then conventional practice and then mainstream. Like you look at how it was just like last week that CNN finally, announced and admitted that, like losing weight might actually improve clinical outcomes related to COVID and blah, blah, blah. It took 2 years to figure that out. It took 2 years to announce to the American public through mainstream media, right? Like that's the delay effect, right? So really at the end of the day, with mental illness and neurodegenerative research, historically, it's all been about neurotransmitter imbalances, which is the kind of outdated like monoamine theory of mental illness. It's all just theoretical until we build up the body of evidence. And so for decades now, the pharmaceutical, and if you look at what big pharma is doing, big pharma knows what they're doing. They're pretty smart, like they kind of run the world. So you have to kind of look at what they're doing to see like what's going on scientifically. And so anyways, they've really shifted, and people see this without understanding it. But so many of the drug commercials these days are different types of these monoclonal antibodies. And I swear I'm going somewhere with this, because like monoclonal antibodies are all the rage, talking about, you know, COVID, but a lot of the commercials, the MIBs and MABs, if you see the drug name ending in a MIB or a MAB, that's a designer antibody that is being created to, you know, block a protein, block a receptor, whatever it is, because that's, you know, how pharmaceuticals really work. If we can block this really important mechanism, and then by blocking that, it disrupts this bad cascade from happening. That's kind of a simple way of explaining how drugs work. So really what they're now looking at for treating mental illness, because the SSRIs, the benzos, all of the antipsychotics, all of these more like neurotransmitter modulating drugs, the efficacy is just really low. Like really low. You know, most people have treatment resistant depression, and they're doing the SSRIs, they're doing the benzos, they're doing antipsychotics, whatever it is, in cocktails. And that's on top of the statins, that's on top of the ACE inhibitors, that's on top of the PPIs and God knows what else, they're metformin and everything else that they're already taking, if they are kind of the standard American metabolism thing. But anyways, my point being, what pharma is starting to drip down the pipeline is monoclonal antibodies that block inflammatory cytokines for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. You know, TNF alpha blockers have a lot of interesting promise and efficacy. Interleukin-6 monoclonal antibodies or interleukin-6 blockers are what are coming. So my whole point in explaining this is that big pharma already knows that inflammation is the main etiological root cause, like driving force behind mental illness and neurodegeneration. They know that. And they're already starting to drip down and do the clinical studies on these drugs that modulate those pathways so that they can make billions of dollars off of blocking inflammation from disrupting mental performance and then neurodegeneration. You know, we see that Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. That's ahead of diabetes, which is 7th. Suicide is number 10. And what we saw, I was just looking at the CDC data the other day, from like 2015 and 2020, and even just in the past few years during COVID, heart disease has gone up. Cancer has gone up. COVID was the 3rd leading cause of death in the US in 2020. Suicide actually was better. Suicide was the lowest it had been in a few years, which I thought was kind of interesting. But then psychiatric drug use is at an all-time high. So my long-winded point being, we have to, I feel like there's this uproar about like pharma is evil. And I don't want to go off into that tangent, you know, there's issues there, but pharma is still very powerful and very intelligent. So if we don't want to be so reliant on pharma and we want to throw a fit about how pharma runs our lives, you actually have to look at what they're doing and learn from that, and look at what can I do to be pharma proof? What can I do to become resilient and healthy enough that I don't need to rely on pharma? I can tune out from those commercials. I don't need to be on 5 to 10 medications to get through the day and still be sick and miserable. So this is obviously where I'm trying to like use that same science, but then educating people on like, cool. So now that we see the scientific truth, what can we do to reduce inflammation in your brain on fire, and in your body? And that's what you and I are all about.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was quite the way to start.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like that. It pivots the argument and the perception, as you say, in regards to, rather than creating a very black or white paradigm around how pharma is the devil and we need to avoid it, there is something that we can learn there. I kind of like that perspective. And with all of that in mind, thinking around inflammation driving neurodegenerative conditions, depression, and mental health, I guess the next question that comes to mind would be, well, what are some of the things that drive the inflammation that we then can start to think about, whether that's from a testing perspective or whether that's just from a lifestyle perspective? What are things that the public need to be aware of that modifiable, I guess.
Oh yeah, it's a big list, and that's kind of I try to kind of post the same consolidated list, multiple times, yeah, ideally weekly, because you just have to drill it into people's heads over and over. Because what we don't want to do, and I see this just all the time, people get too hung up on one thing, one factor, one root cause, like, oh, everything is trauma, so let me just obsess over my unresolved trauma and get lost within myself. And then, then you're creating blind spots subconsciously. Or, oh, it's mold and MCAS because I had 4 doctors that took $40,000 from me and they said it's mold and MCAS, and I'm just going to focus on that and nothing else, right? And so to zoom out, or actually it's more like zooming in, that I didn't address the microglial cell thing, but as far as why I focus so much on microglial cells, that's the main focal point of mental illness and neurodegenerative research. The microglial cells are the innate immune cells of the central nervous system, or the white blood cell of the central nervous system. I like to simply think of them as the guardians and the architects of your central nervous system, as in they're there to protect your brain from toxins, pathogens, foreign invaders, antigens, anything bad, and they use the cleansing fire of inflammation to burn off the bad stuff, right? Acutely under normal physiological conditions. And then they also are co-regulatory in neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. So they help to either, disintegrate neural connections. If like, oh, we don't need that neural network anymore, we can like burn it down and get rid of it. Like maybe that is a neural network associated with self-limiting beliefs and trauma. And as we're healing from that, like we are literally dissolving those neural networks associated with that belief system, those behavioral patterns, so on and so forth. And like, oh, we need to build a new neural network associated with this is in alignment with my higher self. This is how I want to go heal. You actually have to remodel the way that your neurons are connected and firing and communicating with one another. So these microglial cells play such a pivotal role in doing exactly that, like fight off bad guys and literally sculpt your neural networks and sculpt everything about what your brain is doing. And they are the focal point of neurodegeneration and mental illness research. So as far as the major factors, because then my whole point with that being, I focus a lot of my time and energy on how do we modulate the microglial activity? If you want to heal your brain, you want to overcome mental illness or regenerate your brain or overcome trauma, whatever it is, really what we're talking about at the cellular level is how do we modulate how these microglial cells are functioning. Are they really dysfunctional, which is what's going on with mental illness and neurodegeneration, or are they working really, really well? Because we're giving them the right input signals. So then when you look at some of the major things that contribute to microglial dysfunction and heightened neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration, it's all the standard American metabolism milieu stuff, like hyperglycemia and insulin resistance, chronic toxic burden, too many stress hormones, social isolation even, leaky gut, stealth infections, EMF, gluten intolerance, food allergies. So before you know it, that sort of very like myopic reductionistic cellular conversation becomes more of a conversation about your environment, your lifestyle choices, your diet, your psychology and belief systems. And of course, big pharma focuses on, well, let's just give you a pill that changes it for you, so you don't have to change any of that. You don't have to change your psychology, your lifestyle, your environment, because boop, this pill just changes it, biochemically, molecularly. So
beautiful. So I guess that's a great way of thinking about how you can take something that might sound a little bit sort of reductionistic / overly specific, talking about these immune cells within the brain that have this regulatory role to play. But as you say, then being able to bring it back to a more holistic perspective of these are the inputs that are then influencing these immune cells in the brain. Surprise, surprise, brings us back to these kind of lifestyle things that we all go on about. But I think it's nice to understand how these inputs are kind of influencing physiology, because it's one thing to say, oh, maybe you should think about, your physical activity levels if you're dealing with depression or whatever it may be. But to be able to then understand even very basically that this is the why behind it, I think adds that little bit more kind of motivation as well, and people can start to connect dots as well.
Absolutely. I think it's weird these days. I feel like science has kind of been like weaponized these days, and I won't go off on a tangent, but I don't really like what's going on with that. But I do like seeing how people are starting to try to be a little bit more scientific when it comes to things. And obviously what gets hard is people should not confuse, good marketing with good science. That's where it gets blurry and dangerous. But I do think, to your point, just having a conceptual understanding of the science and the technical, it brings more validity to the what and the why of like, well, this is why, you don't need to worry about your microglia. Don't get too caught up on microglial cells or mast cells or anything else. No, focus on the holistic, the whole body, right? Because we could focus on any individual cell or cell line or tissue or organ. And that is where conventional falls short, is because it's so reductionist, myopic, right? They treat the heart in a petri dish, they treat the gut in a petri dish. They're not looking at how it's all holistically involved together. And so this is why we have to look at, the environment, the terrain, the psychology, the lifestyle, because we've been doing this whole like, no, none of that matters. But when things go wrong, we'll just put you on 5 to 10 to 15 prescriptions that all, and it's like, well, why don't we just change the environment, change the input signals that your cells are receiving, from here, from the environment, from your lifestyle choices. And like, we're not dealing with like, when we are dealing with a lifestyle and environment driven epidemic, pandemic, crisis, whatever you want to call it, that really needs to be the focus. And obviously, based on the fact that it took 2 years for the American media to say, yeah, actually losing weight and maybe being healthier, and that can help with what's going on. Like, we really can't sit around waiting for the government to teach us how to reclaim our health. Like, that's at the individual level.
And I think, just trying to step into the listener who's starting to understand that there's this connection between these various lifestyle inputs and brain health and these microglia immune cells. I guess there's so much information that can be considered, and then trying to tailor it to that individual then becomes, okay, well, what are the signs, the symptoms, what areas of your lifestyle can we support based on some basic understandings? What I mean by that is, does someone have chronic digestive symptoms that may indicate that there's an imbalance within the gut that could be contributing to mental well-being, or XYZ? So it provides a brilliant template that we can then bring that individual into the conversation and say, okay, well, what's going on in your health? Because those are the signs that we can then use to either investigate or support, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I think something that I try to preach consistently, because, I know a lot of my content and my business model and everything and research is very like specific in nature, but I never want people, like, what I see too much of, especially in the functional medicine space, is all like, no, this is the root cause. No, this is the root cause. And people just get fixated on that one thing, like I alluded to earlier. And, one of my best bits of advice to, kind of your typical listener is, don't get caught up on like what each functional medicine influencer is saying differently. Don't get caught up on the details of like, well, this person's all about mold, this person's talking about heavy metals, this person's talking about trauma, this person talking about methylation or whatever. No, you've already lost yourself if you're getting too caught up on that. Instead, look at what we all say in common. Like, all of us, we all say, healthy psychology and stress management reduction. We all say, look at your literal and energetic environment and optimizing that. That's you as a microbe in a petri dish. You got to put yourself in the right petri dish to thrive, the right environment to thrive. Looking at taking a really brutally honest look at your lifestyle and your behavioral patterns, because like, without that foundation, we were talking about it off air, where a lot of people, they are pretty lost and pretty sick at times, and they're trying to figure out the root cause in the shortest, but all the while, like, their health at a very, very deep foundational level is deeply cracked. And it's like, you can't, repair this one room of a house when really the whole house is eroding and collapsing because the foundation is totally flawed. So you might need to do whatever you got to do allopathically or protocol or functionally to kind of mitigate some of the damage and slow things down, but you really have to at some point go back to that foundation. Like, we have to fix this at the foundational level.
And you and I both know you more than me, Dr. Tina, who's kind of exploded onto the scene on social media over the last couple of years. But a post of hers that really resonated was kind of just a little bit of her backstory and a lot of the things she did to get well again. Because I think as a practitioner, especially if you either don't have experience yet working with people who are that kind of chronically unwell, or if you haven't gone through that journey yourself, even as a practitioner, I think we can worry that the foundations aren't enough when someone is really sick. But Dr. Tina is a prime example whereby doing consistently things like strength training, hot cold therapy, getting the diet on point was enough over a good period of time to get her from an incredibly sick state of health to now ultimately thriving. So I think it's really important to reinforce that, there are these examples of people who have laid the foundations, they've mastered the foundations, they've built that resiliency back up, potentially obviously alongside some slightly more specific interventions. But it's easy to forget. And I think it's easy to, how should I put it? Sort of just push aside or almost disrespect those foundations, because I definitely see over the years clinically that sometimes when people are really unwell, it's almost like there's a belief that the basics aren't going to be enough to get them well. There's almost like an underlying belief there, which is preventing them from doing some of those foundations. And I think, I'm really interested in all these kind of vicious cycles, whether it's psychological or physiological, that can kind of get us a little bit stuck in a rut.
Absolutely. It's a weird paradox. And I love Tina to death. I'm talking to her in a few weeks, and I just saw her in Vegas a few weeks ago too. She and I first met at a conference a few years ago, and I remember we instantly hit it off. And I remember in that conversation, we just stood there and talked for 2 hours at this event. And I remember one of the things that she said that stood out to me. She's like, "Brendan, I do not treat patients that don't deadlift." And I was like, "I love you." Oh, she's a savage and I love her to death. And I think she does a really good job with that because she's an amazing doctor and extremely intelligent. And she's no BS, and she'll just say it how it is with if you're not doing the fundamentals, it really doesn't matter. And that's kind of the thing there is this, people have been conditioned to really, and have they been conditioned? Have they just lost hope because they're lost in the weeds and kind of confused? I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. But even with some of my own clients, I have a couple health coaches that help support my clientele. And I get this feedback all the time because I have to force people into doing the coaching with one of my coaches. What they want is to look at labs with me and get a protocol. That's what they want. But what they need is really that integration work and where the rubber meets the road. And it's you're not getting it done in the kitchen. You're not getting it done in the gym. You're not getting your steps, and you're not getting the time in nature. You're not reducing your stress. You're not managing it well. You need help, and I have to twist their arms. I get that feedback all the time where then they're working with one of my coaches and I'll hear, because at first they're like, "No, it couldn't possibly be that easy. It's not, just doing these little nutritional behavior changes or the sleep hygiene. It's too simple to be true, right?" But then when they actually are getting help and being held accountable and they're actually starting to do the work on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, they're like, "Wow," and the lights come on, right? Because then they start experiencing the benefit of those daily consistencies. And I think as providers, practitioners, coaches, we have to always make that the focal point. And unfortunately, because I think it's more good for marketing and business, I think a lot of functional providers kind of are like selling the protocol, selling the root cause. And I think that's honestly like more often misleading and not helpful than it is constructive. So I think we really have to keep the client or patient focused on, we have to be doing the fundamentals daily. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what protocol we put you on or what pills, right?
Yeah. And that's why I think I'm just such a big fan of, the concept of resilience, because it covers it perfectly, which is, a resilient mind, body, spirit, soul, whatever you want to think about, is not just this thing that can bounce back from an adverse event, but it's malleable, it's flexible, it is able to adapt to circumstances. And ultimately, whenever someone's unwell, like what you've been talking about there, is there's resiliency has either been kind of corroded or just been flat out lost. And some of the stuff that I've read around resilience and allostasis and allostatic load, I think describe it really beautifully, whereby, there's just been a recalibration in someone's physiological set point, that kind of homeostasis to a new one. And scarily, the body will defend that new sort of regulatory set point as if that is sort of health. And I've sometimes wondered whether this is why sometimes people start a new program, feel better, and then suddenly go back to where they were initially. They go on a different program, they get a little bit of improvement, and then they go back, because actually there's something still there, whether it's perceived or not, which is pulling that physiology and that psychology back into this new regulatory set point. So the idea of pushing the needle, nudging the needle, and doing those daily things consistency to bring back that flexibility and adaptability into the system, it kind of covers everything, whatever topic, whatever condition, whatever organ, whatever marker you want to be talking about. We can always bring it back to resilience, allostasis, allostatic loads. And we know the things that enhance resiliency and allow for that kind of allostatic mechanism. And just, if people are listening and they don't understand yet allostasis, it's a dynamic homeostasis. It is the ability to adapt so we can maintain our original set point. And that, for me, going back to your point, Brendan, around how so many of us are constantly looking for a root cause, it takes us out of a conversation of there's such a thing as one cause, and it takes us into a conversation which is health and dis-ease are both accumulative. It's accumulated over your entire lifetime, and in fact longer than your entire lifetime, to get to where you are today. So even in someone's timeline where there appears to be an obvious triggering event, whether that's they moved into a moldy property, they got exposed to the Epstein-Barr virus, whatever it is, you still have to put that triggering event within the context of everything that happened before then, and kind of question, well, why was that your triggering event? Because it didn't have to be necessarily. And it's that kind of high level perspective that you're kind of obviously drilling into here, which I love.
I love everything you just said, and I'm glad that we're going there. And I think all too often when people are, lost and struggling, they're more inclined to zoom in, when I think what they need to do is zoom out first. And what you're saying about the set point and allostatic regulation and resilience is spot on, and it applies to literally everything. Like, I have a fitness nutrition background, as you and a lot of people know. And, the very first thing you learn as a personal trainer is the concept of specific adaptation to impose demand. And the way that it's taught kind of classically and understood classically is really just in regards to like neuromuscular adaptability. But the same idea of specific adaptation to impose demand, that literally applies to everything about the human experience. This is why, for example, like, why do they recommend that geriatric patients with progressed neurodegeneration do puzzles and do physical therapy? because it gives a stimuli, a eustress that challenges allostasis, that challenges hormesis, and it creates a specific adaptation to impose demand, which develops resilience. Because if you don't give yourself that input signal, they don't challenge their mind with a puzzle, they don't challenge their body with physical therapy, there's no stimuli to encourage resilience, and the degeneration just burns them up, right? You just, it kind of makes me, this comes to mind, it's almost like if somebody, they did a genetic test and they test positive for like ApoE or something, and they're like, well, I'm screwed, I'm going to develop Alzheimer's, so why even bother showing up for life, right? That's the opposite of resilience. And the thing about resilience, it's earned. You don't find resilience in a pill. Like, it's earned. You actually have to do the work. And that's why, like, obviously exercise is huge, and I think the most underutilized medicine. But exercise is such a beautiful metaphor for that, because the whole point is go put yourself in the gym and you're pushing your body just a little past its comfort zone. I don't think it's always appropriate to push it way past its comfort zone. You don't want to overdo it, but you have to stretch further and further. How do you develop, like I'm a big yogi as well. It's like, how do I improve my mobility? And well, I have to develop the flexibility and strength to lengthen even further. And it takes, yoga is not passive. Stretching is not passive. It's not about, well, just yank on this muscle until you stretch it out and make it longer. No, it's more about building strength in the antagonistic muscle, right? Which means it's a very, deliberate effort of, I have to push and pull myself and continuously push myself out of that comfort zone. That's where the adaptation happens. That's where the resilience happens. You can apply that same logic on a psychological and spiritual level.
Absolutely. I think that's really well said. And I think it's really important, I think, to appreciate, as you say, that we're not talking about, crawling out of the gym every time, especially within the context of people who aren't necessarily in optimal health, but it's sometimes as simple as getting into the routine. So I know when I'm out of training, I'm someone that can still peak and trough a little bit with my routine and habits. And I know that the easiest way for me to get back into a routine is not to have any expectation on what I'm going to do in the gym, just to show up and actually think about what can I do and have a bit of fun, move my body, get back into my body, not think last year I deadlift X amount of kilograms. I want to be able to do that again now. I can't, so I'm not going to go. Right. That's kind of sometimes how my mind can work with it. So again, it's kind of just like those little micro goals of starting to build the habit, starting to build the routine. And obviously James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, that a lot of people know, is a great book and a great read to help us understand what are some of the evidence-based ways that we can build some healthy lifestyle behaviors, whether that's around exercise, nutrition, or anything else fundamentally. But yeah, resilience for me is everything ultimately, because as you say, we can bring that kind of model and that conversation onto any condition or topic. But one thing that might spark another little conversation, I guess somewhat separate to that, is a lot of people have talked about the anxiety that has been, pretty obvious at sort of a society level over the last couple of years with COVID. And kind of reflecting on that, I sometimes wonder whether sometimes people's health journey is a way to project that kind of internal fear, and that's why we like to attach to a specific one root cause, because it gives us certainty. It's like, okay, this one thing is what's caused all of my issues. I can kind of latch onto it. I can focus on it. I can be very specific with my supplements and my dietary interventions. And that creates, I think, sometimes kind of an artificial safety that, okay, I definitely know what's going on here, and therefore I can kind of relax in some ways, even though I'm kind of being very hyper vigilant over this one thing.
What you just said might be like one of the most important discussions and things to talk about in regards to like navigating functional medicine, navigating self-healing, or a healing journey, whatever we want to call it. Because that's exactly what people do. I've been posting about this more and more recently, and I typically see people kind of get lost and stuck in one of two major camps, and there's a lot of room in between, but they either kind of go down the more like esoteric, psychological, spiritual, quantum, polyvagal, neurolimbic, blah, 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 you know, they kind of get lost and stuck in all of that, more approaching it from kind of the energetic, psychological side of things. And they tend to totally overlook, like, oh, well, I am diabetic and I'm not doing anything about it. I do have fatty liver and I'm not doing anything about it. I do have a dysbiotic, you know, leaky gut and I'm not doing anything about it. You know, they're not doing anything about those very tangible physiological factors at play because they're so focused on whatever that is. But it goes both ways. Then there's these other people, they'll work with practitioner after practitioner doing all the functional tests, all the protocols. And I think they're also kind of like unconsciously, spiritually bypassing the stuff that they know they should be facing. And so I've been trying to scream from the rooftops of my platform of like, you have to do both. Now, part of this too, this kind of brings me to the importance of being objective in what can often be a very subjective and sort of disorienting experience. And this is why, even in the very beginning of my career, I was so adamant about having strong objective data to qualify progress and to objectively prove that we are making progress for the sake of the neurolimbic system, which I'll touch on momentarily. But like, for example, a real life example to bring some life to this is, you know, a client, and this is like my 18-year-old personal trainer, nutritionist, self-work. Client comes in, they're 150 pounds overweight. What's your goal? I want to lose weight. Cool. Why do you want to lose weight? And I'll psychoanalyze them, do all the motivational interviewing and whatever. Okay, well, do you want to lose weight or do you want to lose weight and get healthier? Oh, well, obviously I want to lose weight and get healthier. Okay, cool. Do you want to lose weight or do you want to lose body fat? You know, I could chop off your arm and that might take off like 20 pounds, but that's probably not what you want to do. Well, I want to lose body fat. Do you also want to gain muscle? Oh, do you also want to feel better? Do you also want more energy? Because I would always have to decondition them out of the, you know, eat less, move more. And like, no, we're going to eat and train to build lean mass, and you will lose the weight you want to lose and feel that you'll be able to achieve all of this if we focus more on improving your conditioning, improving lean mass, so on and so forth. But then here's the big one. How do you want to measure progress along this journey? We have to have some sort of way of showing that our efforts are paying off. And that's the neurolimbic system. That's our reward system. Our brain literally has to experience the sensation of reward to encourage the reformation of those new neural networks that are starting to bud, that are in alignment with these new behaviors and beliefs. But if we don't get the reward sensation, our body is designed to be very energy conservative. So why would we go to the gym every day and work out really hard and not eat our favorite foods and get up early and do all of these very aberrant things that pull us away from our cozy, familiar little lifestyle if we are not getting the reward for our efforts? And so my point with that, you know, the weight loss client, for example, kind of a typical cliche example, and they weigh themselves on the scale every day and they see, oh, that number isn't going down. And so that's giving their neurolimbic system the signal of like, what I'm doing is not working. Why would I keep doing this? So my antidote and remedy to that, even back then, I understood this was, no, we're going to use blood chemistry, VO2 testing, bioelectrical impedance for body fat percentage, because these are very, very sensitive, objective data points that will prove that we're making progress, regardless of how your clothes fit, regardless of how you subjectively feel about yourself, regardless of what the scale says. Because like, you know what, I think your glucose, your triglycerides, your liver enzymes, you know, change happens internally before externally. You know, your strength is going to go up first. Your VO2 is going to go up first. Your blood chemistry is going to change before that. So this is why I'm so passionate about having good data to guide the journey. So that way, whether you want to go deep into spirituality and plant medicine and get lost down that for a few years, or you want to do some mold detox protocol or parasite protocol or whatever, you have sensitive data that shows, is it working or is it not, to encourage those behavioral patterns. And part of the problem is, like with functional testing doesn't generally assess physiology. And that's such a huge problem, because people will skip clinically established, well-studied biomarkers and then do, well, my urinary mycotox said my ochratoxin's at 20 and my citrulline came up detectable. And then that gives them something tangible, like you said, to latch onto. Well, if I just invest everything into detox, because I read a research paper that said mycotoxins cause all these bad things, and they've already lost the game, right? Anyways, so there's lots to unpack there, but I think it's just, these are the conversations we need to be having, because nobody is. It's just the sound bites, what's catchy and what holds somebody's attention span for 15 seconds.
I think it's true. There's a lot to be said about that. And obviously, it's tricky in the sense that practitioners, quite frankly, they need a business. An easy way to have a business is to have this thing, which is like what you specialize in. And I've had this conversation with a sort of a functional medicine practitioner a few years ago now, but it was kind of around that, which is, I think it's contradictory in some ways to say that you're a functional medicine practitioner who's specialized in something, unless you've spent like a decade first understanding all the other bodily systems. You know, you can't be a specialist in autoimmunity if you don't have a really good understanding of the gut, of the stress system, of the detox system, of everything else. So I think unless you've been in clinical practice for at least a decade, you can't specialize as anything. And the more you specialize, we all know this, you can think of incredibly intelligent PhD researchers, etc., who they've gone so down far the rabbit hole. It's very easy to make an argument that whatever that is like the be all and end all. As you said earlier, whether it's mold, whether it's Epstein-Barr virus, whether it's trauma, whether it's mitochondrial dysfunction, whatever it is, you can make a really, really convincing argument. It is all the root cause and the one most important thing. But to come back to that really, truly holistic space and to be able to guide our client there so they have that moment of, aha, I kind of get it now that everything is interconnected. All of these pathways are bidirectional. You can't talk about, we said off air, you know, the muscle brain axis. You can't talk about the brain without thinking about muscle mass and muscle strength as well. But you can't think about muscle strength without thinking about the brain and brain function. Like, all of these things are a two-way street, and everything is communicating with everything else. And that's a beautiful thing. It's kind of trying to get as comfortable as we can, I think, in that complexity, which is the challenge. And I know for my journey, where, you know, I'm training in transformational breath, I've had a few holotropic breath experiences, I've had a few psychedelic experiences, trying to stay in the middle of what I think of the quadrant, where you've got your physical, mental, emotional, spiritual resilience, trying to stay in the middle and not be pulled down one of those. That's really hard, you know, as a practitioner, let alone maybe a member of the public who doesn't have that kind of training yet. So I think what you're saying is absolutely spot on, and also a constant challenge, ultimately, you know, trying to stay centered and level-headed around, okay, there are all of these avenues. I need to explore most of them to some degree, but I need to constantly come back to everything that you've been talking about, really.
Absolutely. You know, I think people, and this is where, well, I have to make a comment on that, because, like, you know, this the kind of self-healer movement and paradigm, which I love and I'm a big advocate for, and I always like to, you know, kind of pay homage and give respect to my friend Dr. Nicole, who really, I credit her for being the first to really popularize that hashtag, that paradigm, that movement, and now it's just all over the place. But I believe people should get credit for what they've done. Now, with that though, there's sort of now already brewing. I can see it. I see it in my newsfeed. I see it in the comments of my platform. I see it in the DMs I get. there's this growing like obsession with self-healing, where now I think people are not committing to getting the help that they should be getting, because they're just like, but I'm self-healing, I'm doing it on my own. And it's like, I had Nicole on my podcast twice. She's been a private client for like 2 years. And I have a testimony and quote from her where she literally says, I think it was on my podcast, and she literally said, like, self-healing is not the absence of other professionals. Like, the point of self-healing isn't to just like figure it all out on your own. She doesn't recommend that. I don't recommend that. It's more about like, you are taking responsibility for your position, you are taking ownership of your situation, and you're ready, willing, and able to do what it takes to ascend to a better place. But I think that's part of it, is people are, following, they're getting lost down these rabbit holes. And because they're not sort of anchored to maybe an objective, non-biased third party, they're just super lost. And even as providers, practitioners, healers, whatever we are, it's hard for us to stay in the middle of that quadrant. It's so easy. And I think there's benefit to, there's a lot of learning to exploring, right? There's, go do a protocol or two, go do a experience or two. Like, that's how, you broaden and expand, but you still have to kind of approach it scientifically, like be a scientist in your own healing, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in regards to, go down those paths, but take what you can from it and then come back to that center. Because as you say, it's very easy to go way down, and it's definitely something that you see someone who, let's say, has gone down kind of whatever you want to call it, the sort of psychedelic breath work. I'd say very much tongue-in-cheek and with a little bit of humor here, kind of the hippie side of things, where it's kind of all out there, and I'm going to heal when I'm, on an altered state of conscious, basically, which is very possible. It can happen. I've had people DM me, sharing me their experiences, and it blows my mind, and it really fascinates me. But it's not a common occurrence, as someone said to me. Like, they felt so grateful that they were able to go into an ayahuasca ceremony with the intention of essentially understanding what was blocking her from physical healing. And she, for context, had inflammatory bowel disease. She was on medications. She was basically, the next step was surgery. Ever since that ceremony, she's been off meds, and she has what she described as perfect digestive health. And these stories they blow my mind, and I think it shows you the potential of healing within these kind of magical environments. But again, she was even the one who said, I understand and appreciate that's not like a common occurrence of people going into ayahuasca ceremonies and healing to that kind of level. But it's taking what you can, coming back, and then integrating, whether that's integrating from a psychedelic experience, integrating from a functional medicine consultation. What can I take from it, and what are the behaviors and habits that I need to cultivate day to day, week to week, so I'm building that resilience, so I'm getting flexibility back into my physiology, into my psychology, into my emotional well-being, so I can start to adapt again. And talking about sort of evidence-based markers that we can track, a beautiful one would be heart rate variability, HRV, which is literally being called in the research as like the best objective marker of resilience, fundamentally. So yeah, I think what you say there also around self-healing is really important, because I picked up on some chatter a while back around kind of the anti-self-healer brigades who are kind of really against that. But it comes back to, we need to all define what the thing is that we're all talking about, because half the time everyone's defining it differently. And that's why there's this kind of huge argument that can develop on platforms.
Yeah, well, and the polarization thing is such a plague in society, and I feel like it's getting worse and worse. And the antidote to polarity is unity, right? So I literally see that with, like, Nicole's a great example, massive platform, massive influence. But now, like, I see people that literally are like building their platform by being the anti that, right? And I'm just like, guys, but if these figures, these influential figures, like, if they actually had an intellectual, respectful, constructive conversation, like, I'm pretty sure they have more in common than not, right? Like, that's part of it. Like, the catchy little Instagram quotes and whatever, that's to grab somebody's attention to be able to effectively convey part of a bigger message, and why free form podcasts like this are so valuable. And I'm glad that you like the HRV, amazing technology and tool. I was just looking at some HRV and PTSD research the other day, which was pretty cool. And I can't, I was wondering if we would get there, and we have to, the psychedelic thing. I know you and I are both really passionate about that. And I think it's worth touching on there since it came up, just because, I think if I'm speaking as like a researcher, I think psychedelic compounds, of various DMT, ayahuasca, LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, so on and so forth. From like a drug efficacy perspective, I think they're absolutely scientifically some of the most promising compounds for the treatment of mental illness, neurodegeneration, and so many other things kind of under those umbrellas. And of course, that's like the clinical, the efficacy, the technical, the, whatever. But it's more like the experience that you get from it, right? Where I think it can be an amazingly transformational thing. It's something that I plan on doing a lot more with as my career goes on. I don't talk about it all the time because it's interesting how it's still not very well received. Like, it's even though, like, man, I mean, that is a booming industry, it's coming, and people are still kind of turned off to it a little bit. But I think there's a lot of truth that can be witnessed through something like that. Now, of course, to the audience, like, I don't think anybody needs psychedelics. You can do the same work without it. But I think it helps you access crevices of your mind and soul that are very difficult to get to otherwise. And I will say, I just, in my, researcher app the other day, it popped up in my newsfeed, and there was this amazing study, N of like over 150,000, and it was a long-term, longitudinal study, observational, and what they were looking at was lifetime use of, I think it was like MDMA, psilocybin, and maybe something else was in there. I think they looked at like, some sort of psychiatric drug. Anyways, but what this lifelong study showed was people that used some of these psychedelic compounds over the course of their entire life, they had less major depressive events than, people that did not, or were using some of these psychiatric drugs. And it's one thing, we already have a lot of cool, like, mechanistic data on, like, we have an understanding of, the molecular mechanisms of how these psychedelic compounds work, but we have to have that long-term data to see, like, yeah, but if you give somebody this for a long time, does it improve, disease endpoints or clinical outcomes? And that study I was looking at was like, yeah, absolutely. So it's super exciting and promising.
Yeah. And going back to one of the mechanisms you talked about earlier from a mental health perspective, neuroplasticity, obviously with psychedelics, one of the primary mechanisms it's thought that helps with, or one of the primary mechanisms that psychedelics work is through neuroplasticity. So going back to what you said there, what came to mind was obviously the concept and the research around adverse childhood events. So how trauma and stresses in the first few years of our lives seem to be able to significantly influence health or disease 30 years later in some studies in adulthood. And that's partly via kind of this neuroplasticity concept, neurons that fire together, wire together. I wonder whether it's the same thing, you know, with psychedelics, especially if they're used, whether, I guess, microdosing, or whether it's someone who goes to ceremony relatively frequently. It's getting late, guys. My brain's going. Well, that's going to have some sort of similar impact, I would imagine, because we know that it's having an impact on neuroplasticity. And I think there's a very similar longitudinal study looking at psychedelics from memory, kind of just like healthy behavior as well, or just health. So, you know, psychedelic users generally have healthy behaviors, and that's not surprising when we think about what do psychedelics do for us sometimes within ceremony. You know, they do have a tendency, I think, to shine the light on things that we weren't willing to shine the light on. And that can be incredibly healing. It can bring us back into our bodies. And it can, especially within the context of having some form of psychotherapy or integration with a coach, it allows us, it facilitates an opportunity for change. And again, I think psychedelics is almost a little bit like functional medicine had, which is those that are now aware of this renaissance that's happening. There are a lot of people that think psychedelics are going to be the magic bullet. And you know, we can be all, I think, a little bit guilty of creating that perception that you can go into a ceremony, have a magical experience, and something's going to change as a result. But for a lot of people, unless you are going through the integration phase with a coach or therapist, nothing's going to change on its own, or not. It certainly isn't definitive. And I've certainly can look back at some of my first experiences where I think as a personality, I was a little bit kind of shut down. I was quite controlling in my day-to-day life. I didn't like giving responsibility away for whatever reason. Those experiences, in regards to the actual psychedelic experience, were a lot less and a lot less profound than some more recent experiences on even lower doses, because I'm now kind of open. I feel safer in those situations to open up. And I think that's such an important message for people to understand. You know, you can't go into a psychedelic experience and expect to have anything. Ultimately, you just don't know what you're going to have on any given ceremony. But it's a beautiful, I think, mirror in regards to where we are. So yeah, it's where my heart is, I think, these days.
Yeah, I think you and me both, and I see that in your content. It's like I'm dying to, you know, do more work around it when it can be received well and everything. And you know, the neuroplasticity, yeah, like I mean, there's a lot of interesting therapeutics that can modulate the microglial cells and promote neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, which is the name of the game. Like the way that I try to teach people, practitioners, whoever, like if we're trying to heal your brain, mental illness or neurodegeneration, whatever, if we're trying to heal your brain, it's this equation of like reduce neuroinflammation and oxidative stress and promote neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And microglial cells are the main cell that regulate both. But neuroplasticity is one of the major branches of that equation. And it seems, based on the current research, that seems to be the main mechanism that psychedelics work. They really act upon the serotonergic system. They promote neuroplasticity. They promote, you know, the regeneration of neurons and neural connections. So it's a very beautiful, like, therapeutic tool to actually help you create the new neural networks associated with new thought patterns, new behavioral patterns, new belief systems, and dismantling, you know, those self-limiting belief systems and so on and so forth. And again, like that's the molecular, but then the experience of it that you're saying, where I think, you know, it has to be done right? You can't just, oh, let me just trip shit and hopefully my life changes. Like, it doesn't work that way. It's, are you a slave to the substance or a master of the medicine? Are you using it therapeutically? And, you know, you might have that psychedelic experience where it meets you where you're at, and anything that's weighing heavy on your heart and soul, it brings it to the surface. And it's not, I would not use the word fun to describe psychedelic experiences. I wouldn't say it's fun. Powerful, yes. Profound, yes. Beautiful, yes. Intense, yes. Fun, Not really. But you have to then do that integration. So you have to, be intentional about it. And what are the major epiphanies and takeaways and thoughts that come up during that session? And then like, cool, now I have to further solidify those neural networks by now I have to put in the work. Now I have to integrate that into my day-to-day beliefs, outlook, behaviors, and actions.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Brendan, I'm mindful of your time. So is there anything that you would like to, I guess, kind of conclude with, whether it's something that we haven't touched on that you think is important to, or anything that you just want to re-emphasize maybe?
I think that was an amazing conversation. I can't wait to share this with everybody, because I think we really took it full circle, right? I think we touched on a lot of the major kind of obstacles that people are going through. And this is where, like, when people are feeling lost down that rabbit hole, like, stop zooming in. It's time to back up and zoom out. And if you have a practitioner, professional that you're working with that's further pulling you down the rabbit hole, I think that's a little bit of a red flag. I think the emphasis needs to be on the holistic picture. But this is again where, hey, if you're trying to just do it all on your own, like, you gotta have, like, having, that's one of the first things I do with any personal private client is like identifying those resources for success and those support systems. You have to have support systems, whether, as a shaman to do that integration work, or a health coach or a functional medicine provider. It takes a full team. So I don't think people should be trying to do it all on their own. We need to be social. We need that reflection and refraction objectivity. And I also want to encourage everybody of using good, solid data and being methodical and scientific with the journey, because otherwise you're just experimenting without collecting data. And then it's kind of meaningless experimentation because you don't know what's working or not. So tracking data is going to be a helpful guide. And I think when you fuse good data with intuition, that's where you learn how to reach your goals and then maintain and evolve, and just the sky's the limit. So
yeah, cool. I think intuition, that could be an entire podcast on its own, right?
Yeah, I think so. I
won't bite and go down that now. So Brendan,
next time.
Thank you very much for sparing the time to come on the podcast. It's always an absolute pleasure to chat, and hopefully we'll connect again soon.
Oh, absolutely. It's always a pleasure, my friend. Thanks for having me. And I love what you're doing. Keep it up. It's such an honor to know you.
Likewise.
Cool.